In preparation for this, I attempted to review the CV of our distinguished speaker this morning, Dr. George Koo, and honestly, I have never seen anything like it. It is 135 pages long and counting. I was happy a few years ago when I got to page 15 on my CV. But given his record, it's understandable. He has on his record over 375 publications, several hundred presentations, and he has served as a consultant to over 350 institutions of higher education and educational agencies. So it's kind of surprising that he fit it all in 135 pages. So, given his background, his expertise, I thought it was appropriate to bring him to campus to kickstart a conversation we're about to have about refreshing our student success strategic plan. We put together a task force back in 2009 to draft a plan that eventually reached 150 pages, full of recommendations, and we're about midway through the 10-year plan that we had set out on. So we're taking a good look at what we've done well, what we've not done so well, and also trying to develop recommendations for the future. So his comments today are designed to help us understand our path and our path forward. To get us started on that path, I'm delighted this morning that we have been joined by our president, Dr. Judy Genshaft, who of course was the architect of our Student Success Initiative. I love pointing out to everybody that when she came on board here, our 6-year graduation rate was at 43%. And last year, as many of you know, and we can't say it enough, our 6-year graduation rate hit 63%, and it's climbing. So we've made tremendous progress under her leadership, so I'm delighted to welcome our president to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just pleased to see everybody here, and I want to tell you that I'm just kind of the overseer of this, but it's all of your work together, all of us aiming in the same direction and helping our students achieve their milestones of success to graduation within 6 years that has made us unbelievably successful, because everybody in this room and outside of this room all help make our students successful. And each year we're having so many graduations that it's standing and shaking everybody's hand is really a pleasure. No, it is. It's great. It is great. Because that's what we're all about, and there is no better occasion for me as president than graduation ceremonies, because to see the students walk across the stage and how excited they are and how excited parents are is what we're all about. So I just want to thank you for all you are doing and will continue to do, because we are truly record-setting in every way for student success. By record setting, we're the fastest achieving this record of graduation rates, how fast we've moved, I think in the nation. And so we were just talking with our speaker, and he said, I'm going to brag about USF. And I said, yes, and tell them all about it, where we are, and, you know, to keep watching USF. So I just want to say thank you to all of you, congratulations, and of course there's still a long way to go, and we're ready for it. Thanks so much.
So here's what we have planned for this morning. We've asked Dr. Koo to present and handle questions in about an hour and a half. So we'll stay here until 10:30, at which point we would like for you to sit at your table and discuss with your colleagues some of the recommendations that you're hearing from Dr. Koo. We'll have a 30-minute breakout period. We'll reconvene at 11. We want to hear back from you, and we've put on your table the Student Success Annual Report, plus a notepad, plus a couple of questions to guide your conversation. So at 11, we're reconvening. We want to hear from you for another open conversation with Dr. Koo. And at some point during that final hour, 11 to 12, Dr. Wilcox, our provost, will be joining us to hear those recommendations. Keep in mind, all this is designed to jumpstart the conversation about how to get to the next level. And to do that, we have the nation's leading expert on student success, Dr. George Koo.
Well, that's a terrific introduction. Am I on? Does it sound like I'm on back here? Okay, I'm on. Terrific. If I'd have known I was the nation's leading expert, Paul, I'd have asked for more money. No, that's what you did to that point. Anyway, terrific turnout, a terrific record of accomplishment. I actually did say that to President Genshaft. I did say that watching this place from afar and now seeing how the numbers are moving is not just a serendipitous act, I don't think. A lot of good things happening here, and you have a lot more on the drawing board. Getting students through there are cartoons and you are supposed to laugh at the cartoons. It's the endorphins running, you know, it keeps you engaged. Getting students through is very important. Lots of data showing that the most important rung on the so-called socioeconomic ladder is that baccalaureate degree. But if they finish and they can't do what they need to do to survive and thrive, it really becomes a hollow accomplishment for them individually, for USF, for the country. So none of us wants our kids, even if they're career lab rats, to quit. But they gotta finish with something that will be useful to them. So you have this terrific booklet, and maybe you're sick of looking at it, or things that point out the goals that you've established yourself. But it's a very bold statement, and you've got now some numbers that suggest that you're actually doing what you say you want to do. So no matter where we come from on this campus, whatever our role is, we're all, well, we're the choir, first of all, so it's good to have us here rehearsing together. But we're all committed at not too abstract a level to making sure that people, I hope we're committed to making sure that the people who come here are different, substantively, qualitatively different when they finish than when they began, and in ways that will help them. So, yeah, you've got these 5 specific student success outcomes, if you will. They're all important. But my talk today is going to focus primarily on the 3 that I think we can impact directly, that we are impacting directly. Not to say that lowering the amount of debt that students leave with is unimportant. It's not unimportant, certainly, and we certainly want them moving into post-college experiences that they find satisfying and useful. And if we do, in fact, help students finish what they start, and if they are more satisfied with their experience here, and equally important, maybe in some ways more important, if they do acquire the proficiencies that they need, these other things are going to follow along. They'll finish earlier, right? They're more likely to get into the satisfying careers that we expect of them. So, Paul laid out the working agenda, and this is you know, on one hand it's a gift. You know, we can sit back for an hour and hear a guy from outside drone. You know, we can, you know, he doze a little bit or think about what we hope to do next weekend. But I hope when that begins to happen, you'll pull yourself back, because the people who've organized this, and you too, want something meaningful to come out of this. Too often you get a talking head from outside, and you know, a nice hour and a half, every cup of coffee, and that's it. And that's not what we want. What we want out of this are some concrete suggestions for the next phase of work in this important arena. So, what's working? What's not working? It's a little risky to be really candid, but my guess is you've surrounded yourself at your table with people you know. In fact, they may already know what you're going to say when you begin to answer some of these questions. But this would be an opportunity to stretch yourself a bit and maybe encourage others to say things that they may not have said before. So that's what's going to happen, and I hope the things that I mentioned to you will maybe spark some different ideas along those lines. I'm at a point in my life where I'm starting to get rid of stuff. You know, a lot of you don't know what I'm talking about in that regard, but starting to get some of you do. Right? Starting to get rid of stuff. And along that line, it's occurred to me that if we were to use as a template in our daily work with students, what we really want them to walk away with from every encounter, from a series of experiences, from a given academic program, at the end of this time here, they ought to be able to do what, by most reckoning, is an unnatural human act, which is to think about their own thinking. Right? To develop a capacity to reflect on the experiences they are having inside and outside the class. And that next level of work is for them to think about how the different aspects, the different pieces of their educational experience, as well as their off-campus experience, connects, building to some greater level of understanding, not just of oneself, but of the world around them, right? So to think about their own thinking, to put the pieces of their life together on an ongoing basis so it becomes richer and more complex and fuller. And the proof of the pudding, what's uniquely American about higher education is we actually expect people to use this stuff, right? To apply it, to transfer. And so where in the undergraduate experience at USF are we requiring students to show us that they can actually do what we say they should be able to do? Where are these experiences, inside and outside the classroom? So this is my mantra. This is what you'll be sick of hearing about. Reflect, integrate, apply. And it's not just a conceptualization. It needs to take root in your work on a daily basis with students. And we'll have some examples of that. So as Paul said, you're committed to me for another 75 minutes. And hopefully a chunk of that time will be spent interacting. It never happens. I always promise it. It's just almost never happens. But I'm going to try. But I want to put this in context, just a few minutes of context, because what's happening today out there in this broader world is very different in terms of what students are going to have to know and be able to do. And then my shtick for the last 20, 25 years has been around this notion of called student engagement. And then there's some practices we've discovered from the work in the field, from the research, and so on and so forth. And then kind of 5 general priorities that you are already working on in one way or another. But I want to remind us of those and maybe throw 1 or 2 in the mix that you haven't thought, you might have thought about, but may not be working on. So what's the nature of this world today? It's not the world, certainly, that my father grew up in. It's not the world that I grew up in. Where are the career planning people in the room? Career planning, come on, where are you? You won't even show you know that you've heard me talk before, huh? You won't raise your hand. Pretty safe. Well, if I recall correctly, when I was in college, people were saying, look, you want to be prepared to do 3 or 4, maybe 5 different things, in your life. You're not going to probably do the same job you started with, right? Well, today, they're talking about 10 to 14 jobs, different jobs, not over the course of one's life, but by mid-career, by age 38. By the way, these data you can trust because they come from the federal government. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, so I didn't make these up, right? Somebody else did. But let's just accept that the trends, likely the trends are true. And you can see this happening with your friends and your family. Young people finishing college, and more of them are in part-time jobs, more of them are holding fixed-term jobs, more of them are holding multiple fixed-term jobs. So this is happening. It's not out there, it's happening now, where you've got 30 million people working in a job that didn't exist last year. So the fundamental question is, what kind of undergraduate experience prepares someone to make their way in this kind of dynamic, churning environment, right? I'm always, I shouldn't be, but I'm always amused by some of the critics out there who say, there are too many people going to college. You know, too many people getting too much education. And what the heck is that about? You know, it's crazy when you live in a world that is ever more complex, where knowledge is at a premium, and that knowledge is continuing to turn over and over and over again. And certainly employers don't agree with the argument that we have too many well-educated people. Now, they may not be happy altogether, right, with some of the things that our people lead with, or maybe the lack of certain things. It turns out that they are generally, I'm moving around too much, right? I can't help myself. I must be nervous. Turns out that employers are pretty satisfied with what our graduates know about what they study, right? The content of the disciplines. They're pretty happy about that. The problem is the content of the discipline, no offense, good faculty colleagues, I mean, I are one of you, you know, 36, 37 years, but the content of the disciplines have too little relevance if our students can't figure out how to transfer what that means. And of course, that content 5, 8 years from now has been replaced by new information, right? So employers want what we do, and when you ask them, as the Association of American Colleges and Universities have done several times, periodically ask employers, they want, well, they're like academic deans. Any academic deans in the room? Even student life deans, Tom, you know? When you talk with the president, what does the VP for Student Affairs want? The Dean of Students, they want more. They want more money. Well, so do employers. They want more. You know, they want people who are better trained, but more than trained, who have this capacity for complex reasoning skills and so forth and so on. So there's Tony Carnevale at Georgetown. You may not know his name, but you may have seen his stuff over the last few years, because he runs this center where they are, among other things, churning up large data sets about who does what kind of job in this country, how much they make at that work, and what kind of background, educational background, they've had. So in other words, he's looking at all sorts of jobs and where people have gone to school and so on and so forth. And so Carnevale comes up, he and his group, with a pretty, to my mind, radical conclusion. Though if we kind of take it apart, it may not be so surprising. In terms of who succeeds post-college, Carnevale says it doesn't really make any difference what they majored in. Which is kind of a stunner, because, and especially at a place like USF, where STEM, you know, Florida and STEM, well, by the way, Florida is like every other state in this union, more STEM graduates. And we probably do need more STEM grads, science, technology, engineering, math. But that in itself doesn't guarantee the kind of bright future that the individual wants. And it doesn't make any difference, really, where the person went. Now, we want everybody to be a bull. For life, apparently. Bull for life. I'm a bullion, but never mind. I know you do. Doesn't make any difference what you majored in, doesn't make any difference where you went to be successful. What really matters is whether you leave with what he calls broad set of cross-cutting capacities. And embedded in those are the usual suspects. They roll off the lips. Critical thinking, analytical reasoning, being able to write crisply and persuasively and give a crisp, persuasive oral presentation and work effectively with others, right? In real time, And there are more on that list, right? Where do students get this kind of background? So AAC&U, some of you know that group, has been leaning into the wheel, you know, trying to convince policymakers and parents and even students, right, that the best background for these cross-cutting capacities is something we have historically come to call liberal education, which has got a lot of baggage, so we can't say liberal education. Can't say liberal arts education either. We've got to come up with something else. Well, maybe you can. But the point is, we know what these categories of outcomes are that most people agree just about everybody ought to have in their repertoire. And I'm not going to go through these. I mean, we know, you know, this is the curriculum, and it's broad-based, a lot of gen ed stuff, so we understand different ways of knowing and understanding and cultures of the world and so forth. Very, very important stuff. You know, it's the foundation. What makes universities universities and not some other kind of social organization. And we know that it's important for people to be able to have these critical thinking, analytical reasoning skills. And also showing up for work on time. How about that? Which is not trivial. You know, a lot of the things you hear employers complain about is, you know, they're supposed to be here and they're not. What's going on? And then we really talk a good game in universities about helping people further develop this moral compass. I'm not taking it off the table. I'm saying just read a local or regional or national newspaper or watch TV, and you know. I want to focus on this last category. It's not brand new, probably has had a lot of different labels over time. Most of these things have. But this notion of deep integrative learning, because I am personally convinced it's the gateway to lifelong learning and the continuing ability of students to make their own way after they leave USF. Now what does it look like? Well, it's pretty fuzzy. Not fuzzy, but it's not easy to wrap your arms or mind around, right? But this is a thumbnail sketch of somebody who is now in a position to do this kind of reflection, application, right? Integration, I got that wrong. You know, making content, personalizing it, not just regurgitating what the book said or what the lecture quoted, but where does this stuff come from and what does it mean to me and how do I put it together in real time, in a continuous basis, in the context of working with others, people who come from very different points of view, different cultures, different parts of the world, maybe, right? Never more important to be not just appreciate human diversity, but actually get to a point where you can accept and see the relevance and validity of someone else's point of view, even though it may be very, very different than your own. That's deep. That's deep learning. And then be able to take this, what we call knowledge, and use it in different contexts, which then begins to look even different a year or two later. That's a thumbnail sketch of deep integrative learning. So where does this miracle, how and under what circumstances do people, our students, many of whom are 18, 20, 22, still, some of you know, still trapped in that dualistic, black or white, right or wrong frame of mind, where do they begin to crack open that, to entertain some complexity, see some ambiguity, some, I was going to say shades of gray, but well, maybe that's good too. I mean, we've got a lot of dimensions of how does this happen? Right? How do we make it happen? Well, there are a lot of things that really matter to student success that occur long before students get to USF. Right? And you know this. Your own predictive models, like everybody else, shows that students who do really well in high school, odds are that they're going to do really well at the university. And there's much more going on there. Family background, socioeconomic status, before students arrive. But after students get here, after they've gone through all of your pre-college socialization and orientation and registration and so on and so forth, what matters? What predicts the likelihood that they're going to stay and finish? Well, Well, we know a fair amount of psychosocial fit. You know, you got to find people who are like you. You know, staying on track. You know, you've got many initiatives here to help students stay on track. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But you know, for example, if a student doesn't finish 18 hours in the first calendar year, they're like a third less likely to graduate in that 6-year period. And the fewer hours they accumulate for academic credit, the farther down they drop. Very important to get the kind of academic and social support systems, services, offices, programs. Well, we got them. You know what the trick is? Getting students to use them, right? I mean, that's really the deal. You know, we got plenty of data. Students say, I know I need to use the tutoring, the writing skills center, and then when you ask them at the end of the first year, did they? They didn't. You know, it's like less than a third of the students who say they're going to use these services actually report doing so. There's not a lot in the literature about this first one. In fact, I may have actually coined that phrase, so you can discard it immediately. But think about this. Think about the prospect. There's a little bit of data to show this, that students who are unable to tell you in their own terms why they are here and what they are getting out of the experience that has value to them are less likely to stay. Think about the student who's sitting in that lecture hall with 300 people, Introduction to Western Civilization. I still can't figure out what that course is about. No, I'm kidding about that. But again, put yourself in the context of a 17 or 18 or 19-year-old who's now being exposed, you know, to 1,200 years or 16 or 3,000 years of history. I mean, does the phrase "holy crap" ever cross your mind? I mean, how? That is downright mind-boggling. Well, I'm overstating the point. But if a student does not see relevance in what they are doing here, it puts them at risk, no matter what their other entering characteristics are. So we have got to find ways of getting students earlier into experiences that show them the relevance of what they are doing, where one of those courses anyway comes to life and they see how they can use it and are already using it in their life. I want to come back to goal road. I will come back. I promise I'll come back to this, because I think there are things we can do in that first year. And some of this comes about because of this last bullet. Getting students to do more of the right things. We didn't make this up. This notion of involvement, or as we call it in this decade, student engagement, is based on literally thousands of the best studies of undergraduate learning and personal development. Some of you know our friends, the Pizza Brothers here, Pastor Ella and Parent Serenity. There are some students in the room. Anybody, how many of you have this book by Ernie and Pat? Either the 91 version or, okay, now, how many of you have actually read it all? This is the one truth. Oh, you have? Oh, no. Yeah, we got a bright eye. This is a senior administrator here who's getting all the money from the Fed and the state and so forth. Yeah, I jokingly say not even Ernie or Pat have read the whole book. That's why it's co-authored. But the point of this is there are very few unequivocal conclusions that you can draw from most of our research, most of human behavior research for that matter. But one of them is, if we can somehow create settings where we induce or cajole or even require students to do certain things, they will benefit in ways that will serve them well. That's really what the student engagement construct is about. And it's not just only what happens in a class or lab or studio. As important as it is, I mean, that's what makes the university really special, right? We're the human instrument, societal instrument that's organized that way. But the stuff that goes on outside of class, yeah, clubs, organizations, the things that are kind of directly related to the extracurriculum or co-curriculum, but there's a whole other world out there that matters to students. When you think about goal realization, I'm talking now about families, church, and I'm talking about work, where they work. And so if you find yourself nodding off in the next 15 minutes, think about how we could use work. I will come back to this too. It's my major closing argument. How we could use work as a way of getting students to see the relevance of what they are learning, right? So, yeah, it is the outside of class experience, especially when students spend what, 70% on average of their waking hours not in class. They are, most of that, many of those hours, not sleeping, take those sleeping hours off, they're in the company of peers. So this is why the literature also shows that the peer influence is huge on how students spend their time, right? You know, they're looking for affirmation from their affinity group. And if that affinity group is spending all their time never talking face to face but flicking back and forth, you know, or other things that may be what we like to say antithetical to the academic mission of the institution, it's a challenge. But there are places that have been able to harness the peer influence with some structural interventions like learning communities, for example, or service learning courses, or living learning centers, right, Thomas, where the out-of-class living environment now gets a little better connected to what we want to have happen. And I know you've got some of those going on here with engineering, for example, and nursing and so forth and so on. So the deal is pretty simple. This really kind of goes back to Tony Carnevale and what you major in, where you go, doesn't matter. It's what you do, what you're able to do, right? And so who a student is when they come to USF, that's not the predictor of how much they'll learn. Oh yeah, we've got funny little logistic models, you know, that people here in your group run, you know, and they'll tell you the odds are that if you've come from this kind of socioeconomic background, you're more likely to finish it. But in terms of the learning outcomes, what we really want to know is, what's really predictive is how a student spends their time. And that's why this gathering, that's why what USF is doing is so important, because how students spend their time is, at least on the margins, a function of what we ask them to do. The kinds of environments we create inside and outside the class. And we've learned a lot in the last 20 years about places that do this work a little better than others, places with better than predicted graduation rates, and you're on that curve yourself, right? Higher than predicted engagement scores. How does this happen where students are doing more of the things that matter? Well, part of it is you got places that are focused on using what we know are effective educational practices. Whoa! I did that on purpose just to wake you up. So you know, this list has been around a long, long time. I mean, it goes back, probably goes back to Noah and the Ark. I don't know, but at least it was, you know, compiled back in '87, and that's been affirmed again by many, many studies. And your eyes just run through the list, and it's pretty straightforward. You know, you can take this list to parent orientation. You can take it. I was going to say you could take it to the state legislature. That might be a waste of time. But the point is, these are almost kind of the old standard. You know, these are mantras. You know, the mantra, right, is the more contact that students have with their teachers, the better, right? If only that were true. Because it turns out, for some students, the more contact they have with faculty, the least satisfied they are. But part of it is, a big part is that those are the students who are struggling. They are going to see their teacher because they are not doing well. And so there's a lot of other stuff going on there. There's a lot of stuff going on in each of these, right? Prompt feedback, but it's not just giving students immediate feedback, it's the quality of the feedback. Just as it is, what really matters in student-faculty contact, I would say student-staff contact, is not how often, it's what transpires. These are data points out of pastoral Terence. It's the nature and substance of that interaction. Nothing wrong with having a soft drink or a cup of coffee, you know, to visit about this, that, and the other thing, but how can you get in there something about, tell me what you're using today that you learned last week that you never thought had any and I use the word relevance, you wouldn't structure the conversation that way, but it's leading them into this kind of more practice in thinking about what's happening to them. So all of these things matter, and certainly it matters to make sure that students, this is about learning how to function effectively with the other, right? It's this active, collaborative. It is not this. You know, active, collaborative learning got a bad rap because we say you count off by 8, go away for 40 minutes, and then come back and tell us what you talked about. See you next time. You know, that's not it. It's a much more nuanced, artful science about which we're learning more and more. And when faculty and staff structure that exercise and intervene when necessary and teach students how to intervene, that's very, very important. Where do students learn how to give feedback to their coworkers? Where does that happen? Is that in that magic box too? And when they get away from here, that's something that they're going to have to be able to do. And these are some of the ideas that drove us to develop the NESI survey, and followed shortly by the Community College Survey of Student Engagement. This goes back now 15 years when we were trying to take from the research and find a way to develop a diagnostic tool that would tell a campus whether students were spending their time on the things that we know would matter for them. So USF has used NESI, as has 1,700 other colleges and universities in North America, and they're using it in Australia and South Africa, and yada yada. And it's, you know, it's pretty straightforward. It's mostly about student behavior, because behavior is what's driving the outcomes that we're after, and those behaviors are to some degree a function of what we ask. How many papers do you write? How long are the papers? How often do you get feedback from students? How often do you interact? You have to work on problems set up by your teacher. How often do you work on those problems outside of class with peers, and on and on and on? And how students feel about USF is very important, but doesn't directly affect how much they learn. But it's huge because it affects whether students are going to stay at USF. So the work that we do both inside and outside of class to validate students, to make sure they get access to the resources and support they need, absolutely essential, even though it doesn't, we call this an indirect effect. And of course, you know, who a student is matters, and you can churn up the data that way and so forth and so on. And we get scales and yada, yada, yada. I want to talk about this. I'll come back to it later, maybe, if you're good. So it's a short survey, and it doesn't tell you everything you need to know about what matters to students, but it does point you to places. It could point you, for example, to residence halls that aren't working very well here. Have any of those? Probably not. Not here. Not here. Other places, I guess. It could point you to groups of students in certain majors, women in certain majors who are not as engaged, even though women, typically, generally speaking, are more engaged than men. Go figure. Who would have thought that? No, yeah. Women, on average, study more. They interact more in positive ways with others. Why? I don't get it. Although most of the people in this room are women, so I guess you outlasted the men. Anyway, doesn't tell you everything you need to know. But engagement is probably one of the best, maybe the best predictor of kinds of grades students get, whether they'll stay, how satisfied they are. By the way, you know, our primary goal is not student satisfaction. It's an intermediate outcome, and it's not trivial, but this place is not about student satisfaction. What we expect, that if we're doing the things that we can persuade students matter to their learning, satisfaction comes along with that, right? So the other way to think about this is if we just give students everything they want, it might satisfy them in the very short term, but not prepare them well for the long term. So, student engagement matters, and it matters along these outcomes that we've talked a little bit about. But like everything else in life, it's more complicated. So there are things in the literature, Pasquarello, Terenzini, other places, it turns out that not every It's not every activity experience affects all students the same way. I mean, that's not much of a surprise, probably, but now you have a term you can use for that, and it's called conditional effects. And I just really began to talk about this in terms of men and women. More women are more engaged than men, and so forth and so on. You buy the book, read it. This is a very important finding that has surfaced just in the last decade. And it has great meaning for our work here as it does just about every place else. There are some activities, some behaviors, some programs and practices that when certain groups of students do them, they have compensatory effects. Okay, now this is an audience participation activity. Compensatory. When we compensate for something, what are we doing? I hear murmurs.
Making it up.
Make up for a deficit. Ding, 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 ding. She should have a full scholarship. Or a raise. Or a raise. Yeah. Certain activities for certain students have huge compensatory effects, helping them, boosting their performance in ways that you wouldn't predict. Hold that thought, right? And then there are what we've come along in the last 5-6 years to coin a phrase, high impact practices. That is, there are some activities that have this compensatory effect but boost the performance of all students. And we've come to call those high impact practices. How many of you are familiar with this phrase, high impact practice? Okay, maybe a quarter. But I bet every one of you thinks you're doing it, even though you don't know what they are. That's what I'm discovering around the world. So this is how behavioral science works. We stumbled into this. That's supposed to be fun. Right? So, you know, back in 04 and 05, we didn't know very much really about certain kinds of experiences that students were having. We knew from anecdote like study abroad. The folklore on study abroad is life-changing experience for everybody. Even though the people who did study abroad didn't have any data. But it was like, we had anecdotal information. The internship. Everybody should have an internship. Not much data really though about them. Well, we churned up a number of analyses at my center, and we ended up writing a monograph called this, which, by the way, everyone should have a copy of. They make wonderful holiday gifts if you don't have something. And I'm going to tell you more about that, and we followed it up just last summer, almost a year from now, with another piece, learning more about institutions that were doing these things, and AACNU has produced some others. This one has been out since December, and somebody here, some group, should take if you haven't already, take a very close look at this, because I mentioned compensatory effects. What Ashley Finley and Tia McNair have discovered with different data sets, not the ones that we've been using, data sets that come directly from institutions in 5-6 different states, the students who benefit the most from, everybody benefits. Let's be sure we got that. That's why they're called high impact. But the students who benefit the most tend to be those from historically underrepresented groups. Underprepared, first-gen, students of color in contexts where they are in the minority, but even, as we'll see momentarily, in contexts where they are close to being majority. So, what are they? I guess I should have shown this first, right? What am I talking about? Well, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm now jokingly calling this the approved list of high impact practices. And I want to come back to this point that there are surely others, but just let your eyes run down that list, and you will momentarily conclude that the good news is that the University of South Florida offers all those things. Hallelujah. Our work is done. And then think about whether you have answers to these questions. How many students at USF do one of these things? Who are those students who do one or more of these things? And how well are they implemented? And do you know? The first two you should be able to get a reading on. And I'm going to predict what you're going to find in a moment. But the third piece here about how well we do these things makes or breaks reading. For example, we service learning. Anybody here coordinate service learning? Do we not let people come in? They won't raise their hand, will they? They're afraid I'm
over here.
So I'm not going to put you on the spot. Well, of course I will, because that's just who I am. It's kind of rude. But you can nod or not. But you know, some elsewhere, my experience is elsewhere, some service learning courses are better than others.
Probably.
Well done. Well, it's probably the nature of the beast, which is true of every one of these. You know, some institutions that have learning communities, these are the experiences where students, the same students, take the same 2 or 3 sections of the same classes, right? And some of those are, right, done better than others. So we can call this like the treatment effect is uneven. But a funny thing happens across the board that each of these has a very, no matter how well they're done on average anyway, they have a very powerful effect. By the way, there's a lot of things we could say about this. You know, this first year seminar is not the orientation to college class. I mean, possible that such a class, such as what you offer, could be one of those, but these data come from kind of 3-4 credit discipline-based small courses taught by, doesn't have to be a full-time faculty member, but it might be writing intensive, it could be linked to a learning community, but what you get out of a small seminars, you might get some common intellectual experiences, especially if they're part of, anyway. We'll come back and flesh some of these out. Now remember way back when I talked about deep integrative learning, the gateway, right, the lifelong learning, and making one's own way. So we begin to play with this in my shop at Nestle some years ago. Nobody around the world has a so-called validated objective measure yet. They're trying to figure this out in New Zealand and Australia and other places. But we think that the more practice students get doing the kinds of behaviors that we believe contribute to this capacity, the more we ask them to put ideas together from, let's say, different classes, right? The more they talk about ideas with faculty outside the class, the more they take what they're learning and use it, try to use it in a different, unscripted, for example, situation. We think the more practice students get, the better, the more likely they are to develop this capacity for deep integrative learning. All right, here we are. We have finally come to what you have been waiting for, the data slides. Yes, 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 I know. So, what you're looking at here is really the explanation for the high impact label. Keep in mind, those of you who've been in the applied behavioral sciences, you know this, that the larger the number of people in any study, we call them subjects to distance ourselves, you know, from them. The more people you have in a study, the easier it is to get a statistically significant finding. Okay? If you didn't know that before, now you know it. Which ought to make you worried every time you read something that people say is statistically significant. So we have 5 million students in Nestle. And you know what it takes to get a statistically significant finding? You turn the computer on. No matter what you ask. So everything on this chart is statistically significant. But let's just take a look. But what these pluses represent are something related, but more important for our purposes. These are called effect sizes, which represents the magnitude of the statistically significant difference between those who do and those who don't. I know you've got chills up and down your spine too, because I always do when I get to this point. So if you've had a service learning course, you are far more likely, this is like a whole standard deviation different. If you've had one, you're much more likely to practice these kind of deep learning behaviors than people who've not been in such a course. The same is true if you've been in a learning community. You know, in fact, students who are in learning communities spend on average, again, this is on average, 20% more time a week preparing for their classes. Now, why in the world would that be? And remember, some of these students who sign up for learning communities don't want to be there. They didn't know it was a learning community. They got assigned to it. And I would submit that a lot of what's going on here is that peer effect. There are things going on there because they now know this group of students, and this is the group of students who are walking to class together, and back to the residence hall or back to the parking lot. And this is a group of students who are kibitzing in the back of the room while the faculty person is trying to lecture. And largely because they're talking about what's going on here because they're, anyway. This is a very, very distinctive pattern of outcomes. You don't see this in the research anywhere. We've been running data every year, and it's the same every year. If you've had a capstone experience, if you've had an internship, if you've been working on a faculty member or staff member in research, you're far more likely to do this, and you're also reporting greater gains. And the reason is, this is a different chart. The reason is you are far more engaged in your university experience. These experiences drive, or at least they're highly correlated with spending more time on academic matters, being more challenged, faculty members who are challenging you to a higher level of performance in class by your own report. You're more likely to be presenting in class. You're more likely to be working on problems outside of class with peers. You're more likely to have the kind of substantive interactions with your teachers that matter to your learning outcomes. And you see the campus environment as being more supportive. This is why we drew the label high impact, because these things seem to affect almost every student in a decidedly positive way. Are you with me? Are the people of USF? So here it is. These things induce more time and energy. The interactions are more frequent. People find themselves, when they're in a service learning experience or in study abroad, or in almost any one of these, because of the peer effect, because they spend more time interacting with peers around, they hear their friend, or people in the class, say things that they cannot believe. You know, they thought they knew this person, but there you are working out in this unscripted, complex situation, and boom, out pops this. And so we try to kind of mimic some of these experiences in the class, but we don't always get there. But they sure come out in sometimes challenging ways. So certainly study abroad. You get more feedback, and the feedback is in real time, right? Because if something blows up in the lab, or if something in a field experience goes awry, you don't just kind of walk away and say, "I'll deal with that next week, we'll see it." You got to fix it, or figure out how to fix it now, or do something, intervene, look for guidance, right? And if we do this well, I mean, the power of service learning, for example, those of you who do it, something akin to it is we systematically ask students to come back from that field experience. By the way, think goal realization. Think about seeing in a palpable, experiencing in a palpable way the impact of your education in real time and seeing relevance. These kinds of experiences put students in situations where they are using, or we're expecting them to use, and if we ask them to reflect, write, journal, come back to class, talk about them, they become more relevant, more concrete, more real, especially when they've got opportunities to apply. And then, of course, we want at the end of the day for them to show us whether they can actually do what we said supposed to do. So this is a student pilot who aced all the written material. I said earlier, this was the approved list. How many of you here, when you were an undergrad, wrote for the student newspaper? You can raise your hand.
Really? Oh,
One,
I was like, am I gonna be proud?
couple, three, more now, but they know I'm not going to jump on you and make you testify. How many of you participated in a touring band or choir? And how many of you participated in intercollegiate athletics? Or you were a leader for a student organization where you actually led. It wasn't just kind of like, oh, look at this. Well, I'm convinced that all of these, and there are others, that could be high impact if we could figure out how to squeeze the reflection integration. I mean, I think what really good coaches do, for example. I mean, I'm gone preaching here, Tom and Paul, but imagine, so I wrote for the student newspaper and I played college basketball. And I can tell you the kind of feedback that I got on my performance in those two areas was very different, but pretty darn powerful. So if you written for the student newspaper and the daily editor, you were probably the daily editor, weren't you? Yeah, that's what I thought. Well, I don't much care for daily editors because they took my Valentine's Day column. I was the headless Norseman at Luther College, so I wrote under a pseudonym and I could slander anybody I wanted. This was the 60s, you know. Took my Valentine's Day column. Were you that day? Took my Valentine's Day column, a piece of work that I had spent more time on than any other class assignment, save my senior paper, cut it by a third to fit the space. Now, what kind of a deal is that? You know, some of my best stuff. Coaches, athletic teams, feedback, immediate, loud, public. You got to respond, and if you don't respond, what do your teammates do? First of all, they don't like you very much. Well, it's not quite that bad, but the point is, it's pretty much like what life will be like post-college. Your work influences the performance of others. Now, I'm not suggesting we try to do that in every setting, right? So there are other experiences. We don't know what they are. We're hunting for them. How well we put these things in play, we've already talked about. There are some academic advisors in the room. I won't ask you to raise your hand. But I want to say that there should be, if I were the czar of academic advising, I would want all my people to say to every advisee in every contact, not have you ever thought about study abroad or ever thought about an internship. I want to say, when are you going to do this? When? Let's talk now about it. Some large number of first-generation students, large numbers of students who come from underrepresented groups. There's no discussion around their family dinner table about studying abroad. It's not because their parents or guardians don't like them. It's just because there's nothing in their experience to suggest that going abroad would be a good idea. Now, we could say that about any one of these things. Study abroad is very convenient. You know. Doing research with a faculty member, even a co-op or internship doesn't sometimes, the family can't talk about it because it doesn't have the experience. And that's why too many of those students are underrepresented in their participation in high-impact activities. The question I asked earlier, at USF, who gets to do them? Now, these are not USF data, but I bet if you ran it, you'd find out that this profile is accurate. And remember the huge compensatory effects that students get. And it's true as you go through the academic program. Fewer of these folks are doing one of these activities. Now, the best part of this, and it's easy for me to say, if you break down what makes a high-impact activity high impact, these things can go on in any classroom, lab, or studio. We just got to figure out how to read more of them. More feedback, more opportunities for students to work on unscripted problems, more opportunities to apply what they are learning to some concrete situations outside of class. So, see, I love this phrase, and I'm the only one who likes it, but I think it's cute. Can't give serendipity to chance. So five implications, suggestions. We know, we're at a point in time, we've been actually at this point in time for years. We know what works more often for most students than not, and we should hold ourselves to using them. So in the classroom, there are certain kinds of pedagogical techniques, let's call them. Many of you aren't working with people inside the classroom, so, but I don't think, I think we could change the labels on some of these, and they would hold, let's just take the second one here. This has got lots of big words in it. You know, it sounds like it came from an academic and so forth. But if you work with students outside the class, I asked some of you, how many of you were student leaders? You know, worked in a club or organization, and I said, really. And what I mean by that is you had budget. You took something, and for a year you were responsible for herding and organizing and structuring and giving feedback and so forth and so on. And then those of us who work with students in those situations, what should we be doing in terms of reflection and integration? I learned late in my classroom teaching life that if, and this would apply too to other situations outside the class, that if I thought that my students were doing the same thing I was doing between my class meetings, I thought they were spending their time thinking about my class. And that they were reading ahead primarily, exclusively for my class. And it turns out that they have other classes. And, you know, you get the drill here, right? But if a faculty member spends 4 or 6 minutes at the beginning of every class hour, reminding students where we've been, what we're trying to do today, how this 50 minutes will unfold, and here are the desired outcomes, we now are doing what Quakers do all the time, and that is we're centering. We're bringing people back into this context because they've got a crazy life outside of it, right? And it turns out when people do that, the learning spikes are there for that particular class session. This is what USF is doing more or less, right, to enhance, increase student success, those five drivers, right? I don't know near enough about the nuances, the quality of a lot of the efforts you have underway, but I'm thinking that you're doing almost every one of these things. Do you require orientation? Not. I'll just ask it again. Yes. Yes. Okay. And do all students come? Yes. They can't register. Yes. All right. Well, so now, you know, perhaps we can come back to some of these things later. You know, what bedevils most universities, large universities especially, is that there are these so-called killer courses. And we got to spend more time on those, right? Because you talk about lowering student debt. Well, if the student has to take the same course 3 times to get through it, they're paying for that. Anyway, you get the drill, right? One of the things that is yet a tough nut to crack is how effectively we communicate with the families of our students. And here I want to put a special shout out to those students whose parents, guardians don't have college experience. And I don't have data on this, but I am convinced that a lot of those students, when they hit a bump in the road, it turns out it's still the case that when a student is thinking about leaving the university, they talk about it with a family member first. Not the activity advisor, not their RA in the residence hall, not a faculty member. They're talking with a family member first, and by the time we hear about it, they've already gotten advice. And this is a generation of students who, by and large, most of the time take the advice of family. It's just crazy. When you ask students where they get academic advising, have you done this here? Most of it, the majority get it from a peer or a sibling who went here, and then those of you who are in the trenches doing academic advising, I mean, you have a great effect if you can just get students to listen to you. So how do we prepare? The point here is how do we enhance kind of what the social capital of many families, so that when their student calls home and says, I can't do it here, there's nobody else here like me, there's nothing here for me, I knew this was going to be a problem, the loving response from the family often is, we were so proud of you for trying. Come on back home. Huh? Am I talking to you? Come on back home and we'll figure it out. Now when my kids called home, I mean, I had a list of 10 offices they had to go through before I was taking another call. Because I mean, I know how the system works, right? And I also know that how a student feels today, a week later, things might be very different, no matter what the intervention has been on the part of the institute. But the larger point here is we got to get more smart people noodling about how to do this. So, money matters, but it's not how much you got. That's not just fitting the president left for this point. Don't tell us. So money matters, but it's not how much, it's where you spend it. Right? And we know this from our own studies of high-performing institutions, but there are economists now that are doing this work, different places. One of them is Jane Wellman, who did a project for Mauna Loa Institute, and it's why. It's intentionality. What's the rationale for putting dollars here? Do you have any data? Are there data elsewhere that would show you that if you invested more in learning communities and figured out how to implement them well, that you would get a return on that investment because more students would stay, which is what the data shows. Right? So you recoup it in tuition revenues and so forth, and so on. And Jane also has done the most recent monograph for AACU, which is about return on investment. If you put money here and you increase student success, you're also increasing revenue captured by the institution. Now, we're going to have to not do some things that we're doing, because you're never going to get enough new money to do things that you really want to do to make something happen. And so this is the hardest thing on the list, frankly, I think, but I use a nice soft term here. The problem with not doing things is some of us in the room own them. We created them. It's who we are. And when you say, you mean my program is not worthy? Not that we don't think you're not worthy, because we want you to do this other thing. So I'll be curious to see if any of the groups here in a little bit touch that hot button issue. What about this? This is a huge, complicated university. Man, this is a huge challenge. But what if USF said, in the next round, our goal is for every first-year student to get involved in some high-impact activity. It doesn't mean that every first-year student does the same. It just means that how can we figure out to get virtually all of them in a learning community, in a service learning course, in a first-year seminar that has a big bang, that's either writing or inquiry intensive, has a peer instructor working with the seminar, right? And maybe there are other high-impact activities that you have data for that are not on the so-called approved list. And you know, our best work is going to be done when we also tie that student in to another high-impact activity that's going to be linked to the major at some point, where more faculty are more likely to take ownership, frankly, you know, in student-faculty research or internship or co-op. Here's Cal State University Northridge, Hispanic-serving institution. About 37% of their students Hispanic. And this chart, along with other data coming out of the Cal State University 23 campus system, is giving them goosebumps. They find that if you've not done a high-impact activity, less than 4 out of 10 finish in 6 years. But if you did one, you're now at about half. And if you've done two-thirds of the students are finishing, which is way above their predicted graduation rate. And then it jumps, not so many are doing more than 3 or more. And you're getting a similar kind of effect with other students at CSU. Now, there are other campuses in the CSU system that are showing similar findings, so that the 23 campus CSU Faculty Senate, the overriding group, is trying to figure out how, as part of the required gen ed program, which is now common across all campuses, how to sew in a high impact practice. Employers love this stuff, no surprise. I don't need to spend time on this, you know. Getting an internship or community-based project, real work, demonstrating you can apply what you're learning, blah, blah, blah. Now here's the kicker. Just about everybody at USF, I bet, over time, at some point in time, works. Maybe it's 80%. I don't know what it is. I don't care. You can't just, I'm just here for a day. What if we captured work and tried to turn it into something akin to a high impact experience? Right? They're already doing it. I don't know how many students you got working on campus. I don't know. In student service, I'll tell you, the University of Iowa has 2,400 students working in their student services division. And they're smaller than you are. And this is the information desk at the campus center at the University of Iowa, where 5 years ago, I mean, it's true, I waxed eloquent on this. Just a little bit to describe it. It's supposed to be joking. You know. They decided to do an experiment there 5 years ago where they had supervisors of students in their office, some on work study, some on hourly, have structured conversations with their student employees. Remember goal realization? Seeing the relevance, the application of something you are learning to some other aspect of their life. That was the driver for this. So they've got more sophisticated, but these are the 4 kind of general questions. And by the way, these slides will be available. You could you can get these now for $19.95. But it's just between you and me. If you act now, you can get the slides I used last week. No, these slides will be available. If you're curious about this, and you will be in 2 more minutes, you just go to you just go to the University of Iowa website and type in all caps GROW. So the deal is supervisors have 2 or so structured conversations each academic term with their student employees around these questions, right? Which is really mostly about how is what you're doing here fit with what you're studying, and what have you learned in class that you're doing here? Simple stuff, right? Very simple stuff, but of the kind that, and so then they do this, you know, happy in the heart, end of term, those students who got the treatment, you know, these conversations, and those who didn't. And then they got some very surprising results. These are old results. Well, actually, no, these are last year, I guess, because you got many more students doing it now. Well, in fact, now everybody, you know, this column has disappeared, but these are statistically significant in the red. This is the one I think is huge. Seeing connections between what I am studying and what I'm doing on this job. Whether we like it or not, students are here to get a job. In fact, every one of them ultimately will get a job. After grad school, whatever it is, they're going to get a job. Or most will get a job. And this is huge. I mean, we'd love for this to be like 89%, but it's creeping up as they get better at this work at the University of Iowa. You know, critical thinking skills. I think in large part this is a result of the conversations in a way that they're having, and they're now doing it in small groups and so forth and so on. If we have more time to talk about Iowa Grow, I'm happy to do it. There are many other institutions around the country. Some of you already do this, probably in your own way. But what Iowa has discovered is going through the kind of the staff development piece, that is getting people who are doing this to talk about what they're encountering. You know, one of the things that happens when you do this the first time with your students is nothing. You pose the question and you get nothing, because this student has never thought about making these connections. Who knew? Who knew there was supposed to be some relevance to this? And of course, when you have a few other students in the mix in that conversation, what they say triggers something in your mind that you haven't thought about before. And I'm not saying it's magic. It's not in the middle of that algorithm, right? But it's very yeasty, and students get better at this over time. And Iowa has learned, and some other places, how to kind of fast forward this by having an upper division student in the mix in that first conversation who can not lecture others, but say, you know, I was surprised when I discovered X. Thinking about one's thinking is a learned activity. Maturation helps, but we can move it along if we give students practice. So, you know, this is 5. You may have 5 others that are more important. One of the challenges, of course, in our work is Aristotle. I like to close with Aristotle because no one can challenge you. Authenticity, typically, of the reference. But, you know, this is John Dewey. A lot of other people have phrased it this way. Many of the things, some of the things, I mean, that we're going to be asked to do that we know we probably ought to do, not things that we have a lot of experience with. And the only way we're going to get there, like, for example, the Iowa Grove people have, is to figure out how to do them. How can we create more situations where our students are telling us what they're thinking and showing us how they're, or at least talking about how they're making these connections, and then demonstrating that they can do the kind of thing that we know, employers know, policymakers know, should be able to do. So that, I think now is the time to take up the collection, and then we'll do the last closing game. All right. Polite applause, and then... very understanding group, more than polite applause. So we've got a little bit of time for comments, questions, testimonials, and if we want to get a mic back here, just shout it out maybe, if you wouldn't mind. And tell us who you are, please.
I have a question. Are there any long-term studies showing success of these high-impact practices?
By long-term, you mean 15, 20, 25 years? Well, not in the way we've defined high impact today. I'm trying to think of those. We have so little, this is going to sound like an apology, but we have so little post-college information. You know, we've left it up to alumni offices to try to collect that stuff. I think anecdotally, again, you know, study abroad has got a pretty good track record. I think if you look at NSF data, some of the folks in the room know more about this than I do in the STEM sciences, that students who've done an undergraduate research project are more likely to go into graduate schools in those areas and become faculty and so forth and so on. But the answer is directly no. We have so little post-college data, it's pretty embarrassing. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I should say there is a study afoot being driven by the Gallup polling organization now, where they're capturing hundreds of thousands of people. It's a multi-year project. They're doing mostly telephone interviews, is what Gallup does, to get at, not to get at this list of high impact practices, but what are the meaningful outcomes of university. And it's refreshing because they're coming at this from the point of view that it's not all about the money. They want to know about life satisfaction, other things that have mattered in their college experience and so on. It's a good question. Ironically enough, my dissertation, back then when you used a quill and scroll, was on post-college outcomes, but it doesn't matter now. Yes, sir.
The
Good morning. You mentioned earlier that a lot of students are aware of supplemental resources, thank you, like the Writing Center and things like tutoring services. So has there been any research done on the disconnect between the knowledge that those resources exist and students actually using them? Is it some sort of stigma that if you're in tutoring, then you're not capable?
There may well be. All I know is the behavior where students say, something like 40+% of students starting college today say they know they need some form of developmental, it's rude to say remedial, but let's call it what it is. They know they will need help in math. They know they should be a better writer. So they say that. And they also signal that they intend to use such a center. But this is before they actually get to the campus. And then it's only, as I said earlier, about a third. It varies a little bit depending upon the nature, whether it's writing or math or something. So all I can tell you is a lot of students come in saying they know they need this, but far fewer use it. You're asking about, now what's the explanation for that? Is it the stigma thing? And I don't know. But I can tell you that you can do some, this is when I was practicing being a dean at Indiana. When we moved the skills centers from the basement of a building in the core of the campus and put satellite offices out in some of the residence halls, the use spiked 30, 40%. So, like, if you build it and you want them to come, you should build it and put it in a place where they are. Right?
The library.
Well, it could be the library. But my point is we made it very easy. And of course, those places get overrun the week before midterms and the week before. Yeah. So, I don't care where you put it, and I don't know about the stigma. I can't answer that question. So here, yes.
Deanna Bullard from USF St. Pete. Related to that.
No.
I'll slow down, I tend to move fast. Deanna Bullard from USF St. Pete, so I'm representing one of the branch campuses. And related to your last comment, I'm wondering if you have any information or data on best practices of these ideal practices in terms of offering them in centralized versus decentralized. What kind of model, related to what you said, like do we build it where they're right there? Do we require it? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I do. Let me take the last part, require. I've become very bullish on requiring things when we are convinced and we now have the rationale to use to persuade students and families that this is important. So there are institutions that require service learning at some point. There are institutions that require students to do research with a faculty member. They tend to be smaller, right? And that's why when I said here especially, I don't know that you could, you're too big to get every student in the same thing and expect at that scale to maintain implementation quality. You have pockets, where some of the academic fields, engineering, forced really 15 years ago by their external accreditor to get better at educating future engineers. So you got them driving something like this, a first-year seminar, learning center, and so forth and so on. So you have examples at USF of places that and I assume they're working pretty well, I have no clue. But you have examples of how you could do it in a decentralized way. And campus culture drives all this, could we get the faculty senate to endorse a HIP requirement for all first-year students when we figure out how to do it, starting small, building, and so on. So yes, it's with a but, and that is we have to be very confident about the research that's driving this and our ability to articulate why. Now, and so the first one was, what kinds of, so I don't know them all, but I can tell you what makes the best learning community, right? Or what makes for a much more robust student-faculty research experience. We have asked questions about those things, and you'll not be surprised. You know, a learning community that's organized around, that's embedded, where one of the courses is writing intensive, and these two courses are taught by faculty who collaborate a little in terms of, I mean, they're not walking in lockstep, but they need to know what's going on in the other class so they can design an assignment or an exam that asks the students to draw on that other exam. Why? To get practice at the integration piece, which drives, you know, dualistic students crazy because they, you know, so a lot of support that goes in there, adding a peer mentor or peer instructor, or some term that we discovered years ago. We didn't discover it, it's an old term. Peer preceptor. I mean, you use whatever language that works, but you've got somebody in that class about the same age of the students who's been through something akin to it, because that peer mentor can look a student in the eye and say, I know why your paper sucks, because you didn't spend any time on it. You know, get with the program. Get to the writing center. Get to the writing center. I did the writing center, and all the better if, you know, if that student kind of looks like somebody in the class and so forth and so I'm sorry, where are you? So yeah, we've got a list of about 8 or 9 pieces, and I could say the same thing about student faculty research and so on, but I won't. Take maybe one more or something.
Right here. George, can you talk a little bit about campus cultures and how they're different, and timeline to implementation when they want to make these kinds of changes? Because institutions all the time say, yeah, we're going to do that, and then they run into campus culture that says, no, you're not.
Yeah, well, I think you said it, Michael. Thank you for pointing that out. Well, you know, a place this size, we could say it has a campus culture, but that's a thin veneer because it's too big and too complicated, and you get into disciplines and they look different, right? And then you get into the residence hall part of it, and you know, few people smirked when I said, I bet some of your residence halls aren't quite as, because that's true in any big campus, and we work at that all the time. So I don't know what else to tell you about campus culture other than it's good to be a bull, right? And it's good to be bullish about lots of things. And then we have to stand back and know, be convinced that there are certain aspects of our campus culture that don't work as well as they could if they were bent a little bit. And bending culture is a long-term exercise. So what you got to find, you know this better than I do, Michael, you got to find places that have kind of a crack in the armament, right? You got to find, you know, a dean or a couple of department chairs who want to go this route with learning communities. You can't pull all the levers at one time and expect everything to fall into place, because the implementation quality will suffer. So timelines, I can't tell you about timelines. There are probably a few things you could do by next fall, but you're not going to get every first-year student in a high-impact practice next fall. But if you said, look, 5 years from now, we want to be the first research-intensive university in the country to have every student in a high-quality, high-impact practice, or call it whatever you want. You know, make up your own name for it. But remember, it's the because that's really important. Just to kind of walk around and say, we're in high-impact practice, it's got one, and what's the result? Well, the result is mixed. Well, crap, you don't want the result. You know, you want it on balance to be pretty positive.
Thank you, George. Well, that was pretty stimulating. I'm excited. But I'll calm down. We want to turn to you now. And we want to invite conversation in response to George's comments, in response to his identification of what the best practices are. We'd like you to think about this in 2 different ways. And I think there's a worksheet in the center of each of your tables. we'd like you to think about the best practices that we currently employ, what we're doing well at and should continue. And then think about the other side, the practices that George identified that would make a difference that we need to start or be better at, and have conversations about that. It would help us if each table identifies someone to serve as a reporter, and someone else to serve as a recorder, because we want to collect your thoughts. Whether we have an opportunity to talk about all this over the course of the morning or not, we do want to collect your thoughts. So it would help us if you would record the things that you come up with. But before the morning ends, we're going to ask you, each table, or most tables anyway, to tell us what you discussed, and we'll use that to improve our efforts in student success. So we'll give you about a half an hour to do that. Use that time if you need to take a break and get more refreshments, but come back to your table because we take an attendance and we know who's here. So get started with the conversation. Thank you.